I remember the very first time that I saw her. It was a few seconds of a picture-perfect, blissful scene that I cherished the most. I would have missed that chance if I didn't get lost when I delivered a suit for an old client. Oddly enough, I've been delivering for the same client several times for years, yet I still got lost somehow. I was struggling to carry the unnecessarily large box containing the order, so I had to stop for a second to fix the package. And there, I saw her. The beautiful, soft red hair brushed against my face as she walked past me. I still remembered the faint floral scent of her hair, and that beige long sleeves paired with faded blue jeans. With just the smell of her beautiful hair and her presence alone, my heart was caught right then and there, and then it skipped a few beats as she turned her head when she crossed the street. I couldn't believe that I would come across such a beautiful woman. As I went home after delivering the package, I was haunted by her face. I only managed to glance at it for just a few seconds. The smell of her hair was stuck in my nasal memory, and it lulled my senses and swayed my mind as I went to sleep that night. It was the best rest that I ever had. I kept thinking about her for days, replaying that mere 3 seconds that I saw her face. I remember how soft her hair was and how it brushed against my face in the same way that it brushed against hers. And I was thankful that I got lost that day. So thankful that I marked it all inside my head. 9:24 a.m. The particular nick on the red fan-shaped tiling on the wall a few feet from the bank, at least 20 steps away from the pedestrian crossing, and a button that I plucked from the suit to remind me. Our old client called and said that the button was missing from the sleeve of his suit. I was ordered to go there once again to fix and replace it personally. Spending a couple of hours on the train felt far longer as I couldn't wait to get lost again. 9:22 a.m. I got there 2 minutes earlier. I was probably too excited that I walked faster than I usually did. I stood on the exact same spot, right next to the fan-shaped tiling on the floor at the front of the bank. 3 minutes had passed. Every tick of the clock was taking my hopes away. 9:36 a.m. The security guard at the bank was starting to look at me suspiciously. I tied and untied my shoes 7 times just to kill time, which seemed to drag roughly as the seconds passed. And there she was. It was 9:45 when she finally arrived. Just as how the seconds dragged too slowly before she came, it suddenly went faster as she ran past me. She was wearing black jeans matched with a white shirt this time, and that bright top complemented her hair so nicely. I just stood behind her as we let the vehicles pass by, and I hurried along since she was in a rush. She was probably running late for work, and the crowd that seemed in a hurry as well just made it even harder for me to keep up. But despite of the different smells mixing in the air, the odors of different colognes and perfume, I could still identify the smell of her beautiful hair. It smelled just like how it was when it brushed across my face. As I tried to get closer, something suddenly stopped me. Someone had stepped on my loose shoelace, and she got further away from me. I failed to tie my shoes properly when I panicked as I saw her arriving. It was really bothering me, so I had to fix it first. Unfortunately, she had already stepped inside the bus before I got to her. I wanted to make the person who stepped on my laces pay for what he did, but there was just too many people that I failed to identify who it was. On the bright side, however, I managed to spend a longer time in her presence. Right after replacing the button of the suit for our old client, I went back home. I was in a constant trance all throughout the entire day, as I remembered every single moment that I laid eyes on this girl. I dissected every second, like separating each picture of every minimal motion she made. I engraved her image inside my head. I remembered the silhouette of her body frame against the white blouse and her tight jeans, the tone of her bright skin, and that deep sunset red hair that captured me at the beginning, and flat walking shoes allowing her to move swiftly with fairly wide gliding strides. I had to see her again, and I knew when and where. 9:15 a.m. I went to the bus stop the next day. I assumed she needed to be at work by 10 a.m. She was probably late before, so she would try to go earlier this time. And I was right. The stunning lady wearing a denim jacket with a sleeveless shirt underneath arrived at the stop just 5 minutes later. Her hair was tied, and it was the very first time that I had a good look at her face. And I couldn't help but stare at her as she stood right next to me. Being so close to her got me so nervous, and I wanted to say hi. I wanted to introduce myself or just simply say anything, but I was so captivated by her presence that I was at a loss for words. But regardless of what I might say, I had to get her attention first because she was wearing earbuds. My heart was beating so fast, and I almost couldn't hold myself when her arms brushed against mine as she stepped into the bus. I just followed her. I wanted to sit next to her, but I was so tense that I knew that I would just make a fool of myself if I did. For this time, I'd be satisfied by just being a shadow. Wherever she would go, I would go with her. I sat right behind her, and there I had a good view of her nape. She had a tattoo of a torn blue butterfly at the back of her neck. I wondered what it meant. She stepped off the bus 30 minutes later and went inside a cafe. I just sat at the table and pretended I was reading a paper that I had just grabbed from the seat of the bus. Another time was marked inside my head. At 10 a.m., she would need to be in this cafe and serve as a barista. The black apron made her skin complexion shine even brighter. The place was pretty jammed since it was located at a busy city surrounded by several office buildings. I fell in line patiently when I saw her at the counter. It felt like the time suddenly stopped as everything else halted when it was finally my turn to make an order. I was not prepared for what happened next. With a lovely smile of her soft pink lips, she looked straight into my eyes for the very first time. I was so deeply enamored by the moment that I was lost in her bright blue eyes. I was in a daze that it took a moment before her voice reached me. And just like that, I made a fool of myself by saying, "I want a coffee." I even muttered and struggled those silly words out just to utter a sentence, and it didn't even make any sense. But I was glad that I did. She chuckled when she heard what I said and started to give me options. I wasn't even hearing what she was saying. I was just staring at her as she moved her mouth and fluttered her eyes. I just pointed at a picture and ordered whatever it was. I didn't even drink coffee then. I wanted to bottle that very moment and treasure it forever. It was the first interaction I had with her, and that experience was irreplaceable. And I finally knew her name, Bethany. During lunch, the place got so packed and people started behaving so brashly that I needed to leave. I was satisfied with what had happened for the day. I was also scolded when I got back home since I left during working hours. Having a boss as a father of a small custom tailor shop didn't warrant me to leave as I pleased. Ever since I knew where Bethany was working, I started going there almost every day and spent most of my time at the cafe for as long as I could tolerate the noise of the crowd. The father was not pleased, and his way of enforcing discipline wasn't exactly a painless approach. I didn't mind. I was used to father's punishments, especially now that all I cared for was seeing Bethany. But as I revolted, father's punishments became even harsher. He also didn't appreciate my obsession with the torn blue butterfly. I was embroidering it to almost everything that a lot of garments went to waste. He was starting to get under my skin, and so I went under and through his, until I made something. My late mother probably wouldn't approve of my style, but they always asked me to bring something new to the table, so I did. I decided to move out and rented a small place in the city. At least I wouldn't need to travel for a couple of hours to get to the cafe. Leaving home was the best decision I ever did. I was able to spend more time at the cafe and just stare at Bethany. I still didn't like what coffee tastes like, but it didn't matter. Finding a job vacancy was more challenging than I thought. I had no other experience aside from working for my father, and it made things intolerably hard. I managed to get hired as a waiter for a diner not far from the cafe, and I would sneak out as often as I could to have a short glance of her pretty face. As I got closer and closer, I began wanting more. I would always try to slip my fingers across hers every time she would hand me my coffee, just to feel her soft skin. She was probably starting to notice me then, and I should probably ask her out eventually. I even made a suit in preparation for it, and I wouldn't have done so if it wasn't for that man who kept on picking her up every time she would leave work. She never smiled at me in the same way that she was smiling at him, and I deeply envied the way she wrapped her arms around his and giggled like a child. The new fabric that I used wasn't holding up as good as I expected, and I needed to find something less aged and easier to dye. This new wallet, belt, and anything I could make of this particular leather probably won't sell, but it was an accomplishment for me in a far different level. I had to stroll around to find a new supply, and I knew just where and when I could find it. A few days later, Bethany just stopped showing up to work. I was a little worried about her, and I wanted to console her for the passing of her dear lover. She was probably devastated and needed a shoulder to cry on. I managed to know where she lives, and I wanted to go there, but not knowing how to approach her troubled me, especially at the time of her mourning. The presence of this man she used to love couldn't have been any better when I decided to visit his wake. The casket was closed since his body was not where it should be. We deeply adored the same girl. A part of him was somewhat a part of me. I would hold her dearly beloved in the same way that he was holding up. He was a fine man indeed. Her friends decided to leave her there when the night came, and I stayed to look after her from a distance. When she finally left the wake, I carefully followed. I wanted to walk beside her, but I didn't know how to comfort her. Her eyes were red and her cheeks were flushed. Seeing her in such a way for the first time captivated me even further. Despite of her miserable appearance, her face was still breathtakingly alluring. From the direction she was going, she was probably heading to her apartment. I couldn't help myself, and so I kept on following. I wanted to talk to her, but all I could do was stare from the furthest seat of the bus. I wanted to hold her head against my shoulder and caress that torn blue butterfly on her neck. Just then, she unexpectedly turned her head towards my direction, and she was utterly frightened by something. Her sulky eyes opened wide as she tried to hide her fear by covering her face with her soft hands. As she ran those soft fingers against her lovely face with that genuinely fragile emotional state, I was deeply attracted. She panicked and ran out of the bus even before we reached the bus stop, and so I followed. She ran into a dark alley and nobody was around, and I suddenly heard the voice of her ex-lover. He wanted to wrap his arm around her for the last time, so I took off my belt in respect to his desire. I ran my fingers around this soft leather as a sign of approval. She was calling for help at the end of the alley, so I immediately came. Her eyes portrayed a very helpless maiden at her most vulnerable state, and it was so astonishingly beautiful and priceless. This wasn't my idea of a first date, but this would have to do. She backed away as much as she could until she found herself leaning on a wall. As I stared at her beautiful blue eyes amidst this drearfully dark alley on a starless night, I wrapped her former lover's arms around her neck and made him embrace her tight. For the final embrace of a fine man given by another lover that deeply desired her. It was a picture-perfect scene that ended with her very last breath. I remember the very first time that I ran across this amazing girl, and I could still feel her soft red hair as it brushed against my face. I remember the very first time that she looked at me in the eyes and took my breath away. I am reminded of her every time I hold my purse with a print of a torn blue butterfly on the finest leather that I ever placed my hands upon. She is now everywhere around me, at peace. Anywhere I look inside my room, I see her, every piece of her.